After being saved by a fisherman, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw the pendant, the same one he had given to his beloved before she disappeared 18 years ago. The storm hit without warning. One moment, Michael Delaney was standing on the deck of his luxury yacht, staring out at the calm, endless horizon of the Pacific Ocean. And the next, the sky had turned dark, clouds thickening with an ominous fury. He barely had time to react before the wind picked up, howling through the air, and the waves grew to monstrous heights, crashing against the side of the boat. Grabbing onto the railing, Michael felt the violent shudder of the yacht as it was tossed by the sea like a toy. Panic started to creep in, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the railing tighter, trying to keep his balance. He had been out here, drifting along the California coastline, to clear his mind, to find some peace. But now, peace was the last thing on his mind. The storm intensified, rain pouring down in sheets so thick he could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. The yacht groaned, tilting dangerously to one side as the waves continued to batter it from all directions. Michael's heart raced, knowing he had to act quickly. He rushed to the helm, trying to steer the boat back toward the shore, but it was no use. The storm was too strong, the sea too wild. A deafening crack rang out, and Michael's world tipped sideways. The yacht had hit something, rocks maybe, but whatever it was sent him flying across the deck, his body slamming into the railings. He felt a sharp pain in his side, but there was no time to dwell on it. The yacht was sinking. His mind raced, survival instincts kicking in. Michael scrambled to his feet, gripping the railing as he fought to stay upright against the lurching boat. He stumbled toward the emergency life raft, but before he could get there, another massive wave crashed over the deck, sweeping him off his feet. The icy water engulfed him, dragging him under. For a moment, everything was black. Michael couldn't tell which way was up or down as the waves tossed him like a rag doll. His lungs burned, screaming for air, but all he could feel was the cold, crushing weight of the ocean pulling him deeper. Then, as suddenly as it started, the chaos faded. Michael felt himself drifting, his body weightless in the water, the fight draining from him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought about Emily, the woman who had vanished from his life 18 years ago. He had never stopped searching for her, never stopped loving her, even though the world had told him to move on. Now, it seemed, he was about to join her, lost forever. But fate had other plans. Michael awoke with a sharp gasp, his body jolting to life as if he had been shocked. He blinked, disoriented, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. The sound of crashing waves was gone, replaced by the faint rustle of wind through trees and the steady drip of water. He wasn't in the ocean anymore. Slowly, he lifted his head and looked around. He was lying on a rough wooden floor, covered in a blanket that smelled faintly of salt and smoke. The room was small, dimly lit by the soft glow of a lantern hanging from the ceiling. His body ached, every muscle stiff and sore, but he was alive. "Easy there," a deep voice said from nearby. Michael turned his head, wincing at the sharp pain in his side, to see a man sitting in a chair by the door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered skin and a scruffy beard. His clothes were simple, worn jeans and a flannel shirt, the kind a fisherman might wear. Where am I?" Michael croaked, his voice barely more than a rasp. "You're safe," the man replied, standing up and walking over to him. "I found you washed up on the beach after the storm. You're lucky to be alive." Michael tried to sit up, but the pain in his ribs made him wince. "My boat?" "Gone," the man said, shaking his head. "Storm tore it to pieces." Michael let out a slow breath, the reality of the situation sinking in. His yacht, his pride and joy, was gone, but he was alive. For now, that was all that mattered. "What's your name?" the man asked, crouching beside him. "Michael," he replied, still trying to catch his breath. "I'm Jack Coleman," the man said, extending a hand. Michael took it, shaking it weakly. Jack's grip was firm, his eyes kind but sharp. like a man who had seen his share of storms. "Thank you," Michael muttered. "I owe you my life." Jack shrugged, just doing what anyone would have done. But as Michael lay back, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random act of kindness. There was something about this place, about Jack, that felt strangely familiar, even though he knew they had never met before. He was alive, but his journey was just beginning. Michael lay in the small, humble room, the soft sounds of the ocean in the distance barely registering in his mind. His body ached, and his head pounded, but he was alive. He had Jack to thank for that. Still, something about the entire situation felt off. He couldn't quite place it, but the sense of familiarity that had struck him when he met Jack lingered. Days passed, and Michael slowly regained his strength. Jack was kind, but kept to himself. He would check on Michael regularly, offering food and water, but their conversations were brief. Michael spent most of his time resting, staring at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts. His mind drifted back to New York, to his life of luxury, and inevitably, to Emily. Even after all these years, her disappearance haunted him. Every decision he made, every move in his career, was shadowed by the memory of the woman he had lost. But here, in this small house by the sea, Michael felt something stirring inside him. There was something about Jack, about this place, that tugged at old wounds, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. One morning, as Michael finally managed to stand and move around the small house, his eyes landed on something that made his breath catch. Jack was standing at the small kitchen sink, his back to Michael, and around his neck, swinging casually as he worked, was a pendant. A small, delicate pendant, shaped like a heart. It was the pendant, the very same one Michael had given to Emily all those years ago, a gift before she had disappeared. He had spent endless nights clutching that memory, wishing he had done something, anything, differently. His heart began to race, pounding in his chest as the realization hit him like a freight train. He felt lightheaded, the room spinning as he struggled to maintain his composure. How could this be? How could Jack, a fisherman living in the middle of nowhere, have the pendant that he had given to Emily? Michael's hands clenched into fists as he fought back the wave of emotions that threatened to crash over him. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe Jack had found it somewhere, some flea market or antique shop. But deep down, Michael knew the truth. This was no coincidence. Without thinking, Michael spoke, his voice strained. "That pendant." Jack froze, his hand still under the running water, the sound of the faucet the only noise in the small kitchen. Slowly, he turned around, his brow furrowed as he looked at Michael. "What about it?" Michael's throat felt dry, but he forced himself to continue. "Where did you get it?" Jack glanced down at the pendant, his fingers instinctively reaching up to touch it. For a moment, he said nothing, just staring at the small silver heart in his hand. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "I found it." "Found it," Michael pressed, his voice rising slightly. "Where?" Jack met his gaze, his expression calm but guarded. "Years ago, it was on a woman I pulled from the water." The world around Michael seemed to blur as Jack's words echoed in his mind. A woman. Pulled from the water. Michael took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "When? How long ago?" Jack scratched the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden interrogation. 18 years ago, give or take. There was a storm, kind of like the one we had last week. I found her washed up on the shore, unconscious. She didn't remember anything about who she was or where she came from. Michael's hands trembled as he processed what Jack was saying. 18 years ago, the same amount of time that Emily had been missing. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in a way that made his stomach churn. "And this woman," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, She's still here? Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. She's my wife now. Mary! Mary, Michael repeated, the name foreign on his tongue. His chest tightened as he struggled to breathe. Could I meet her? Jack hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were trying to gauge Michael's intentions. Why are you asking all these questions, Michael? Michael swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't tell Jack the truth. Not yet. Not until he was sure. It's just that pendant. It belonged to someone I cared about. I need to know if it's a coincidence or if... Jack's face softened slightly, though the wariness never left his eyes. She'll be back soon. You can meet her. Michael nodded, though the tension in the room was palpable. He could barely contain the storm brewing inside him. If Mary was truly Emily, if she had been alive all this time, living with no memory of her past, how could he confront her? And what about Jack? The man had saved her, taken care of her for nearly 2 decades. How could Michael tear their lives apart just to reclaim what he had lost? He didn't know the answers to those questions. All he knew was that he had to see her. He had to know for sure. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over the horizon, Michael stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the shore. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, hope, fear, anger, and confusion all tangled together. He didn't know what he would say when he saw her. He didn't know how she would react. But one thing was certain. His life, and hers, was about to change forever. The evening light faded into dusk, casting long shadows across the small, weather-worn house as Michael paced by the window. His thoughts were racing, looping back to the same impossible question. Could it really be Emily? Could this Mary Jack spoke of be the woman he had loved and lost all those years ago? Every second that passed felt like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to prepare himself for what he might see. The sound of footsteps outside snapped him from his thoughts. Michael froze, his body stiffening as the door creaked open. Jack stepped in first, wiping his hands on a towel, his face unreadable. Behind him, Michael caught a glimpse of a woman entering the house. For a moment, it felt like the air was sucked from the room, the walls closing in around him. She was there. The woman who stepped through the doorway was older than the image burned into Michael's memory, but there was no doubt in his mind. It was her, Emily. The softness of her features, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, the familiar curve of her smile. She had aged, but she was still beautiful, still the woman he had loved with all his heart. But she wasn't Emily anymore. Mary, Jack said as he placed the towel on the table. This is Michael, the guy I told you about, the one I found after the storm. Michael's throat tightened as Mary turned her eyes toward him. She smiled politely, with the warmth of a stranger greeting a guest. But there was no flicker of recognition, no spark of familiarity. She didn't know him. She didn't remember him. Nice to meet you, she said, her voice soft and kind, as she extended her hand. Michael hesitated for a split second before taking her hand. The feel of her skin, the touch of her fingers, it was so familiar, yet distant. He felt a lump in his throat, struggling to find the words. You too, he managed to choke out, his voice betraying the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. She smiled again, a small, pleasant smile, before moving toward the kitchen to help Jack prepare dinner. Michael stood frozen, watching her move around the room with a calm, graceful ease, as though nothing in the world was out of place. It was surreal. He had spent the last 18 years imagining what it would be like if he ever found Emily. But this was something he had never considered. She wasn't Emily. Not anymore. She was Mary, Jack's wife, living a quiet life by the sea, completely unaware of the world she had left behind. As they sat down for dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. Jack and Mary exchanged casual conversation, talking about the day's work and the upcoming storm that was predicted to hit the coast again. Michael, on the other hand, could barely focus. His mind was spinning, trying to grasp the reality of the situation. "So, Michael," Mary said, drawing him out of his thoughts. "Jack tells me you're from New York." Michael nodded, forcing himself to speak. "Yeah, I've been living there for years. Work keeps me busy." She smiled, her eyes kind but distant. "I've never been to New York. I imagine it's quite different from here." "You could say that," Michael replied, his voice tight. He wanted to say more, to ask her if any of this felt familiar, if there was anything deep inside her that remembered who she really was. But he couldn't. Not yet. Jack cleared his throat, sensing the tension. "Michael's been through a rough time," he said, his tone sympathetic. "Lost his boat in the storm. Figured he could stay here with us until he's back on his feet." Mary nodded, her expression warm and compassionate. "Of course, you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Michael barely heard her. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. How could she not remember? How could she look at him with those same eyes, the ones that had once been filled with so much love, and not know who he was? After dinner, as the night deepened, Jack excused himself to step outside and secure the boat for the incoming storm. Michael found himself alone with Mary, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between them. "So?" Mary said softly, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Jack told me you were asking about the pendant." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to bring it up so soon, but now that she had, he couldn't hold back. "Yeah, it looks like one I gave to someone a long time ago." Mary's brow furrowed slightly. "Really? That's interesting. Jack found it with me when he rescued me." Michael swallowed hard, fighting the urge to tell her everything. He couldn't destroy the life she had now. "Do you remember anything about before Jack found you?" Her expression softened, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Not really. I've had some flashes here and there, nothing clear, just fragments. It's like trying to remember a dream after you've woken up. It's always just out of reach." Michael's chest tightened. She was so close, yet so far away. He wanted to reach out, to pull her back to the life they had shared. But how could he? How could he drag her back into a world she didn't even remember? "You seem familiar," Mary said suddenly, her voice soft and tentative. "Like I've seen you before." Michael's heart pounded in his chest, a surge of hope rising inside him. "Maybe we've crossed paths before," he said carefully. "You never know." She smiled faintly, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a spark of something more. Maybe. The door creaked open, and Jack returned, breaking the moment. Mary straightened, giving Michael one last curious glance before turning to help Jack. Michael stood there, torn between the past and the present. He had found her. He had found Emily. But she wasn't Emily anymore, and now he didn't know if he could ever bring her back. The days passed slowly, each one blurring into the next. Michael stayed in the small, modest house by the sea, watching Mary from a distance, trying to make sense of the impossible situation he found himself in. She seemed happy, truly happy, in her quiet life with Jack. She smiled often, her laughter filling the house with warmth, and she moved with an ease that Michael hadn't seen in her before. She had built a life here, far removed from the chaos and luxury of New York. It should have been comforting, but it only deepened the ache in his chest. Michael couldn't help but wonder if he had a right to interfere. Emily, Mary, had no memory of her old life, of the years they had shared together, or the love they had once had. Was it fair to pull her back into a world she had forgotten? He wasn't sure anymore, but every time he looked at her, The memories of their past came rushing back, and the desire to tell her the truth grew stronger. Then, one night, everything changed. It started with a dream. Michael was woken in the early hours of the morning by the sound of muffled cries coming from down the hall. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding as he listened intently. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was Mary. Without thinking, he threw off the blankets and hurried down the hall to her room. The door was slightly ajar, and as Michael approached, he saw her tossing and turning in her sleep, her face twisted in distress. Jack was still sound asleep beside her, oblivious to what was happening. Michael hesitated at the doorway, unsure if he should wake her, but the sound of her murmured words stopped him in his tracks. No, don't go, don't leave me." Her voice was soft, broken, and filled with pain. Michael's heart clenched as he recognized the same tone she had used all those years ago, when she had begged him not to go on yet another business trip, not to leave her alone. He took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what was happening. She was dreaming about him. "Please, come back. Don't leave." Her words grew more desperate, her hands clutching the sheets as if reaching for something or someone that wasn't there. Michael's chest tightened, the weight of the years they had lost pressing down on him. He wanted to reach out, to wake her and tell her that he was right here, that he had never really left, but he couldn't. Not yet. Suddenly, Mary gasped, her eyes flying open as she sat up in bed, her breath coming in ragged gulps. Michael quickly stepped back into the shadows, watching as she ran a hand through her hair, clearly shaken by whatever dream had plagued her. She glanced over at Jack, still asleep beside her, and let out a shaky breath before slipping quietly out of bed. Michael retreated back down the hall, slipping into the living room just as Mary padded softly out of the bedroom, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She didn't notice him as she made her way to the window, wrapping her arms around herself as she stared out into the dark, moonlit ocean. For a long moment, Michael stood in silence, watching her. She seemed lost, her gaze distant, as if she were searching for something just beyond her reach. It was in that moment that Michael realized she was starting to remember. He could see it in the way her brows furrowed, the way her hands tightened around her arms as if trying to hold herself together. The memories were coming back, but they were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. And yet, they were enough to unsettle her, to make her question everything she thought she knew. Michael took a deep breath, his heart racing as he stepped forward. "Mary?" She jumped, startled by his voice, and turned to face him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Michael, I didn't know you were still awake." "I heard you," he said softly, keeping his voice calm. "You were talking in your sleep." Her expression faltered, her hands dropping to her sides. "I was?" Michael nodded, his gaze steady. "You were calling out for someone. You seemed upset." Mary looked away, her eyes flicking back to the window. "It was just a dream," she muttered, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice, as if she didn't fully believe her own words. "Do you remember what it was about?" Michael asked gently, stepping closer. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, she shook her head, her shoulders slumping slightly. "No, I don't remember much of anything, really. It's like there's something I'm supposed to know, but I can't quite grasp it. It's frustrating." Michael's heart ached at her words, at the confusion and sadness in her voice. He wanted to tell her the truth, to fill in the missing pieces for her, but he knew it wasn't that simple. She had built a life here, with Jack, and he couldn't tear that apart without knowing how she truly felt. "I've been having these dreams for a while now," Mary continued quietly, her eyes still fixed on the ocean. "Flashes of places, people, things that don't make sense. But when I wake up, It's like they slip away before I can figure out what they mean." Michael swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. She was so close. "Maybe they're memories," he said cautiously, watching her closely for a reaction. Mary frowned, her brow furrowing as she considered his words. "Memories." "It's possible," Michael pressed. "Sometimes, when people lose their memory, things come back to them in fragments, like dreams. Maybe that's what's happening to you." Mary's lips parted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty passing over her face. "But why would I have forgotten everything? What happened to me?" Michael's heart raced. This was the moment he could tell her everything. But before he could speak, the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway made them both turn. Jack appeared, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his brow creased with concern. "Everything okay out here?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Michael and Mary. Michael forced a smile, his heart sinking as the moment slipped away. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "Everything's fine." But as he watched Mary retreat back into the safety of her routine, Michael knew that everything was far from fine. The days that followed felt like a fragile balancing act. Michael continued to stay at Jack and Mary's home, but the tension was palpable. Every interaction, every glance between them carried the weight of unspoken truths. Mary, now more often lost in thought, seemed to struggle with something deep inside her, as though she was trying to reach for a memory that hovered just out of sight. Michael observed her closely, but always from a distance. He was conflicted, torn between the urge to tell her everything and the fear of what that revelation would do to her, and to Jack. Jack had been nothing but kind to him, welcoming him into his home, offering him shelter and food. But Jack had also kept the truth from Mary for all these years. That reality gnawed at Michael, making him question everything. One afternoon, as Michael walked along the rocky coastline, trying to clear his mind, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Mary approaching, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her face pensive. She offered him a small smile as she came to stand beside him, her eyes drifting out toward the ocean. "This place is beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice carried by the wind. Michael nodded, though his thoughts were far from the scenery. "Yeah, it is." They stood there in silence for a while, the waves crashing against the rocks below. Michael could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air, the ones Mary hadn't yet voiced. He knew she was searching for something, and he wondered if she would ever find it on her own. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Mary said suddenly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "About the past, about what Jack told me, that I washed up here with no memory of who I was. It's strange, you know, not knowing where you came from." Michael's chest tightened. He had spent every moment of the last few days preparing for this conversation, yet now that it was happening, he felt unprepared. "I can't imagine how hard that must be," he said quietly. "To not know who you are, where you belong." Mary nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "I've never questioned it before. Jack was so good to me. He saved me, gave me a new life. I've been happy here. But lately, I keep wondering, what if there's more to my story? What if I had a life before all this?" Michael's pulse quickened, every instinct screaming at him to tell her the truth. But he hesitated, unsure if it was his place to disrupt the fragile peace she had found. "Do you really want to know?" he asked cautiously, his voice low. Mary looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. "I think I do. It's been years, and for the longest time I thought it didn't matter. But now, these dreams, these flashes of memories, they're haunting me. I can't stop thinking about them. It's like my mind is trying to tell me something, but I can't make sense of it." Michael swallowed hard, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, a voice called out from behind them, "Mary!" They both turned to see Jack making his way toward them, his expression concerned. Michael felt his heart sink. The moment had slipped away again. "I've been looking for you," Jack said as he reached them, his eyes flicking between Mary and Michael. "We need to talk." Mary frowned, glancing back at Michael before turning to Jack. "What is it?" Jack hesitated for a moment, his jaw clenched, and Michael could see the tension in his posture. "It's about Michael," he said finally, his tone careful. Michael's heart raced. He had known this conversation was coming, but he hadn't expected it to happen now, like this. He braced himself, ready for whatever Jack was about to say. Mary looked confused, her brow furrowed as she glanced between the two men. "What do you mean?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about how Michael showed up here, about the questions he's been asking, and I think there's more to his story than he's letting on." Michael felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. He had tried so hard to keep the truth hidden, to figure out the right time to tell Mary who she really was. But now, it seemed that Jack was going to force his hand. Mary looked at Michael, her eyes filled with confusion. "Michael, is that true?" Michael hesitated. The words caught in his throat. He could feel Jack's eyes on him, filled with suspicion and protectiveness. It was clear that Jack had his own concerns about Michael's intentions, and now those concerns were about to come to a head. Michael began, his voice faltering. "There's something you need to know, Mary. Something about your past." Jack stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Michael, don't." Michael turned to face Jack, his heart pounding in his chest. "She deserves to know the truth, Jack." Mary looked between them, her confusion deepening. "What truth? What are you talking about?" Jack's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Michael thought he might try to stop him. But then, Jack stepped back, his shoulders slumping slightly as if in defeat. "Fine," he said quietly. "If you want to tell her, go ahead." Michael swallowed hard, turning back to Mary. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and anticipation. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke the words he had been holding back for so long. "Your name isn't Mary," he said softly. "Your real name is Emily. Emily Turner. You disappeared 18 years ago, and I've been looking for you ever since." For a long moment, there was silence. Mary, Emily, stared at him, her expression blank as if she couldn't quite process what he had just said. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, Emily shook her head. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's not possible. I don't remember any of that." Michael stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "I know it's a lot to take in, but it's the truth. You had a life before this one, a life with me. We were in love, Emily. We were going to get married." Emily's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she took a step back. "I don't understand." Michael felt his chest tighten with pain, but he pressed on, knowing that he had to help her remember. "You don't have to understand it all right now. Just trust me." But as he reached out to her, Emily shook her head again, the tears spilling down her cheeks. I can't do this." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing there, heartbroken and unsure of what to do next. Michael stood frozen, watching Emily, no, Mary, disappear back toward the house. His heart ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. It was the kind of pain that came from seeing something you wanted so badly slip through your fingers, knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it. Jack was silent beside him, the weight of the moment hanging heavy between them. Michael could feel the tension radiating from him, as though Jack had been holding something back all this time. It wasn't just suspicion or protectiveness. There was something more, "She'll come around," Jack finally said, his voice low. But the words felt empty, as if even he didn't fully believe them. Michael turned to face him, the frustration boiling over inside. "You knew, didn't you? All this time, you knew who she really was." Jack's face darkened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Michael thought he might deny it, but then Jack let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping as though a great weight had finally settled on them. "I knew," he said quietly. "I've always known." Michael's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Then why? Why didn't you tell her? Why would you let her live like this? With no memory of her past? No idea who she really is?" Jack met Michael's gaze, his expression hard and unreadable. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if she remembered, she'd leave, and I'd lose everything." Michael's chest tightened with anger, his voice rising. "You kept her here, trapped in a life that wasn't hers, just because you were afraid? That's not love, Jack. That's selfishness." Jack flinched at the words, but he didn't back down. "Maybe it is, but you weren't here, Michael. You didn't see her when I found her, broken, scared, with no memory of anything. She was lost, and I gave her a life, a new start. I gave her peace." Michael shook his head, the frustration boiling over. "You gave her a lie." Jack's face hardened again, his eyes flashing with anger. "And what would you have done, huh? Would you have taken her back to New York, thrown her back into the chaos of the life she ran away from? Because that's what she was doing. Michael, she was running. I didn't know who she was at first, but I knew enough to see that she was running from something." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Jack, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in his mind. Emily had been running. But from what? From him? From their life together? It didn't make sense. "I never meant to keep her from you," Jack continued, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "But when she didn't remember, I thought maybe it was for the best. She found a new life here, a life that made her happy. Who was I to take that away from her?" Michael felt the weight of Jack's words pressing down on him, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. "You took away her choice," he said, his voice tight. "You didn't let her decide for herself." Jack nodded slowly, his expression filled with regret. "I know, and maybe that's my biggest mistake. But now you've told her, and there's no going back." Michael turned away, running a hand through his hair as he tried to process everything. Jack's confession had hit him hard, but it didn't change the fact that Emily, Mary, was still living in the dark. She deserved to know everything, not just pieces of the truth. "And what about Sophie?" Michael asked suddenly, the question slipping from his lips before he could stop it. "Does she know?" Jack stiffened at the mention of Sophie's name, his eyes narrowing. "No, she doesn't know. She thinks Mary is her mother, and I'm her father. That's how it's been since the day she was born." Michael felt his heart clench at the thought. Sophie, his daughter, had grown up thinking Jack was her father. She had no idea that her real father was standing right in front of her. "You can't keep this from her," Michael said, his voice hard. "She has a right to know the truth." Jack's expression darkened, and for a moment Michael thought he might argue. But then Jack sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know, but it's not going to be easy. Sophie, she's my whole world. Telling her the truth could tear everything apart." Michael's chest tightened. He understood Jack's fear. He understood it all too well. But that didn't change the fact that Sophie deserved to know who she really was. And so did Emily. "I don't know what to do, Michael," Jack said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of years of guilt. "I've tried to protect them, to keep them safe. But now I don't know if I did the right thing." Michael turned back to him, the anger simmering down into something else. Something that felt a lot like sympathy. Jack wasn't a bad man. He had made mistakes, terrible ones, but he had done it out of love. out of fear of losing the only family he had ever known. "We can still fix this," Michael said quietly, his voice steadier now. "But we have to be honest with them. They deserve to know the truth." Jack nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with resignation. "You're right," he murmured. "It's time." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on both of them. Michael knew that whatever came next wouldn't be easy. Telling Emily the full truth, telling Sophie, would shatter the fragile life they had built here, but it was the only way forward. "Let's go back to the house," Jack said finally, his voice low and somber. "We need to tell them everything." Michael nodded, his heart heavy with the enormity of what was about to happen. Together, they turned and started walking back toward the house, the sun sinking lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. As they approached the house, Michael's mind raced. He thought about Emily, about Sophie, about the life they could have had together. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. The walk back to the house felt like an eternity. Michael's mind raced with the weight of what was about to happen. The truth, long buried, hidden behind fear and secrecy, was finally going to come to light. But even with that knowledge, he couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety in his gut. Would Emily, Mary, be able to handle the full truth? And what about Sophie? How would she react to the revelation that everything she believed about her family was a lie? As Michael and Jack approached the house, the setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the yard. The wind carried the faint scent of salt from the ocean, mingling with the distant sound of crashing waves. It was a peaceful evening, but inside the house, peace was the last thing Michael expected to find. When they entered, the house was quiet. Jack cleared his throat and called out, "Mary?" Emily appeared from the small kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face still held the traces of confusion and hurt from their earlier conversation, and when she saw both men standing there, her brow furrowed. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice cautious. Michael could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her fingers gripped the towel a little too tightly. She knew something was coming, even if she didn't know exactly what it was. Jack stepped forward, his voice softer than usual. "We need to talk, Mary, about everything." Emily's eyes flicked from Jack to Michael, her expression wary. "About what?" she asked, though there was a tremor in her voice, as if part of her already knew the answer. Michael took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment they had been building toward since the second he saw that pendant around Jack's neck. He had imagined this conversation so many times in his head, but now that it was actually happening, the words felt heavy, as if they would break everything the moment they were spoken. "About your past," Michael said quietly, meeting her gaze. "About who you really are." For a long moment, Emily said nothing. She just stared at him, her brow creased in confusion. "What do you mean? I already told you I don't remember anything about my past." Michael swallowed hard, the truth burning in his throat. "That's because it was hidden from you. Jack knew, but he didn't tell you. You were someone else, Emily. Your name wasn't Mary." Emily's eyes widened slightly, and she took a step back, as if trying to put distance between herself and the words that were coming. "What are you talking about?" Jack stepped in then, his voice filled with regret. "He's telling the truth, Mary. I should have told you a long time ago, but I was afraid. I didn't want to lose you." Her face went pale, her grip on the towel tightening as she looked at Jack with disbelief. "What do you mean? What are you saying, Jack?" Michael watched as Jack's shoulders slumped, the weight of his years-long secret finally becoming too much to bear. "Your name, it isn't Mary. It's Emily. Emily Turner. You were someone else before you washed up on that shore all those years ago. I knew who you were, but I didn't tell you because I didn't want to lose you." Emily shook her head, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. No, that can't be right. Why wouldn't you tell me? Why wouldn't you? I was scared, Jack interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. I was scared that if you remembered, you'd leave me. I was selfish. I kept the truth from you because I didn't want to lose the life we built together. Michael could see the pain on Emily's face, the way the words seemed to pierce her like daggers. She took a shaky breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. I don't understand. If that's true, then why don't I remember? Why can't I remember anything about my life before you? Michael stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. Because it was buried deep. Trauma. Fear. It can make us forget things. Sometimes even the things that matter most. But those memories, they've been trying to come back, haven't they? In your dreams, in those flashes you've been having. That's your mind trying to tell you the truth. Emily looked at Michael, her eyes filled with unshed tears. And you? How do you know all this? How do you know who I really am? Michael's chest tightened. This was the hardest part, the part where he had to admit just how deeply connected they had been, how much they had lost. Because, Emily, we were together. We were in love. We were going to get married. Her face went pale, the words clearly overwhelming her. No, that can't be true. I don't remember any of that. Michael felt his heart shatter at the pain in her voice, but he pressed on, knowing she needed to hear everything. It's true. We had a life together, Emily. We loved each other. But then you disappeared, and I never stopped looking for you. I never gave up hope that I'd find you again. Emily's breath hitched, her body trembling as she took another step back. But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not Emily. I'm Mary. I've been Mary for so long. Michael's voice softened. You're still you. Whoever you choose to be now, that's up to you. But you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know who you were. There was a long silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. Emily stood there, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process everything she had just learned. Michael wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew that this was something she had to come to terms with on her own. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more complicated, Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs. What's going on? She asked, her voice small and filled with confusion. Michael's heart sank. This was the moment he had dreaded the most, the moment when they would have to tell Sophie the truth about her own life. He could see the panic in Jack's eyes, the fear that this revelation would destroy everything they had built with Sophie. Jack cleared his throat, his voice shaky. Sophie, honey, we need to talk. Sophie frowned, taking a few steps down the stairs. About what? Michael's chest tightened, his heart aching for the young woman who had no idea what was about to be revealed. This was going to change everything, for all of them. Jack took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. It's about who you really are. Sophie stood at the bottom of the stairs, her wide eyes flicking between her parents and Michael. Her face was filled with confusion, her brows knitted together as if she couldn't quite grasp what was happening. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, the weight of all the unspoken words hanging in the air. Jack took a hesitant step forward, his voice soft but trembling. Sophie, there's something we need to tell you, something about your past. Sophie's frown deepened. My past? What are you talking about? Michael watched as Jack struggled with the words, his hand shaking slightly as he gestured for her to sit. Just sit down for a moment, please. Sophie hesitated, glancing at Emily, who was still standing in shock, her hands trembling at her sides. There was a brief flicker of something in Sophie's eyes. Fear, maybe. But she slowly made her way to the couch, sitting down, her hands clutching the fabric of her jeans as if bracing herself for whatever was about to be said. Jack exchanged a glance with Michael, who nodded slightly, urging him to continue. This was Jack's moment, his chance to come clean to both Sophie and Emily. His voice was strained, and his expression revealed just how painful it was for him to tear open the secret he'd held for so many years. "Sophie," Jack began, his voice thick with emotion, "I've loved you like my own since the day you were born. You're my daughter in every way that matters, and nothing is ever going to change that." Sophie's face softened slightly, but her confusion lingered. "I know, Dad. Why are you saying this?" Jack's eyes filled with unshed tears as he took a deep breath. "Because you're not biologically my daughter." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sophie's face paled and her mouth fell open slightly. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael felt his heart break for her, watching the shock and pain ripple across her face. This was the truth she had never expected, the reality she had never imagined. Jack swallowed hard, his voice wavering. You're Emily and Michael's daughter. They're your biological parents." Sophie stared at him as if he had just spoken a foreign language, her mind racing to make sense of what he had said. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head in disbelief. No, that can't be right. I'm your daughter. You and Mom." She turned to Emily, who stood frozen, tears spilling down her cheeks. Emily's lips trembled as she struggled to find her voice, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. "It's true," Emily said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't remember, Sophie. But now I do." Sophie's breath hitched, and she pushed herself up from the couch, stepping back as though the room was suddenly closing in on her. "No," she said, shaking her head furiously. "No, this doesn't make any sense. You're my parents. You and Dad, this is my family." Tears streamed down Jack's face as he reached out to her. "You are our family, Sophie. That will never change. But we couldn't keep this from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth." Sophie took another step back, her chest heaving with the weight of the revelation. She looked at Michael then, her eyes pleading for answers, for something that made sense in the middle of the chaos. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "Are you really my father?" Michael's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. He stepped forward, trying to keep his voice steady, though the emotions were threatening to overwhelm him. "Yes, Sophie, it's true. You're my daughter. I didn't know about you until recently, but I swear, I never stopped searching for your mother." Sophie shook her head, the tears flowing freely now. "No, this can't be real. You're strangers. I don't know you. You can't just show up and say you're my parents. This isn't how it works." Michael's throat tightened, and he fought to hold back his own tears. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that everything would be okay. But he knew that nothing he said right now could make it better. This was her reality crashing down around her, and no amount of comforting words could fix the pain she was feeling. "I know it's hard," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I know it's confusing, but we love you, Sophie. We've always loved you, even if we didn't know." "Stop!" Sophie screamed, cutting her off. "Just stop! You don't get to just show up and tear my life apart. I don't want this. I don't want any of this." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie's chest heaved with sobs, her hands shaking as she wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold everything together. Jack took a hesitant step toward her. "Sophie, honey, please. We'll figure this out together. We'll make this work. You're still our daughter. We'll always be your family." But Sophie wasn't listening. She turned on her heel and bolted for the door, the sound of it slamming behind her echoing through the small house. Michael stood there, staring at the door, his heart aching in a way he had never experienced before. His daughter, the daughter he hadn't known he had just run out the door, shattered by a truth that he couldn't change. Emily let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands as she sank onto the couch, her whole body trembling with the weight of it all. Jack moved to her side, wrapping his arm around her in a gesture of comfort, though his own face was filled with despair. Michael remained frozen, his mind racing with everything that had just transpired. He had spent years searching for Emily, for answers, for a second chance. And now that he had found her, now that he had found their daughter, the reality of it all seemed more complicated and heartbreaking than he had ever imagined. "I should go after her," Michael muttered, his voice hoarse. Jack shook his head. "Give her some time. She needs space right now." Michael knew Jack was right, but the ache in his chest only grew. He had missed so much, so many years, so many moments. And now, after all this time, he feared he might never get the chance to make it right. But even in the midst of all the pain, there was something else. Something small, but undeniable. Hope. The truth was out now. It had shattered their lives, yes, but it had also opened a door. A door that could lead to healing, to forgiveness, to the family they had lost and might yet find again. But only if they could all find a way to move forward. The hours after Sophie ran out felt like an eternity. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of the waves crashing in the distance. Emily hadn't moved from the couch, her body hunched over, her hands trembling in her lap. Jack sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her back, but neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air, suffocating any attempt at comfort. Michael stood by the window, staring out at the horizon, his mind a swirling mess of emotions. He kept replaying the moment over and over, the look on Sophie's face, the hurt in her voice, the way she had bolted out the door like she was trying to escape the truth itself. He felt powerless, like everything he had worked toward had crumbled the moment the truth came out. He had spent years searching for Emily, for the life they had once shared. But now that he had found her, the reality was so much more painful than he had ever imagined. And Sophie, his daughter, was out there somewhere, devastated by the revelation that everything she thought she knew about her life was a lie. After what felt like hours, Emily finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft, barely audible, but it sliced through the tension like a knife. "I don't know what to do." Michael turned from the window, his heart aching as he looked at her. She seemed so small, so fragile, her face pale and tear-streaked. This was the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost, and now she was here, struggling with a truth that had shattered her entire world. Jack squeezed her shoulder gently, his face filled with sorrow. "We'll figure it out, Mary. We'll get through this." She shook her head slowly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if we can. I don't even know who I am anymore." Michael took a step toward her, his voice soft but firm. "You're still you, Emily. Whoever you were before, whoever you are now, it doesn't change the person you've become. You've built a life here, a family, but you also had a life before this, and that's part of who you are too." Emily lifted her tear-filled eyes to meet his, her expression one of pure confusion. "But how can I just go back to that life? I don't even remember it, Michael. I don't remember you, or our love, or anything about the life we had. How am I supposed to make a choice between two lives I can't reconcile?" Michael's chest tightened. He had been prepared for her to struggle with the truth, but hearing her say it out loud was harder than he expected. The woman sitting before him wasn't the Emily he had once known. She was Mary, Jack's wife, Sophie's mother in every way that mattered, and now she was torn between the past and the present. Jack's voice was gentle as he spoke, but there was an edge of fear in his words. "You don't have to go back to anything, Mary. This is your life now, with me and Sophie. We can get through this. We can make things right again." Emily looked between them, her face a portrait of inner turmoil. "But I'm not just Mary. I'm Emily too. I can't ignore that anymore. Michael stepped closer, his voice steady. You don't have to choose one or the other. You can be both. You can remember who you were without losing who you've become. Emily's breath hitched, her tears flowing more freely now. But what if I don't want to remember? What if I can't be that person again? Michael's heart ached at her words, but he knew he couldn't push her. This was her decision, her journey to figure out who she wanted to be. Then you don't have to, he said softly. It's your choice, Emily. Whatever you decide, we'll all find a way to live with it. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence was thick with the weight of their emotions, with the impossible decision that lay before them. Emily buried her face in her hands, her sobs quiet but heart-wrenching. Jack sat beside her, his own pain evident in his eyes. I've loved you for so long, he whispered. I don't want to lose you. Michael's chest tightened. He had spent years hoping for this moment, hoping that Emily would remember him, that they could pick up the pieces of the life they had lost. But now, standing here in the middle of a life she had built without him, he realized how much more complicated it was. He loved her still. That much was undeniable. But he also knew that Jack loved her too. And in his own way, Jack had been the one who had saved her when she was lost. After what felt like an eternity, Emily wiped her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what the right choice is. I don't know if I can be the person you remember, Michael. But I also don't know if I can just forget everything I've learned today. Michael nodded slowly, his heart heavy. I don't expect you to have all the answers right now. Just take your time. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Jack's voice trembled as he spoke, his hands trembling in his lap. We'll figure this out together, Mary. You and me. We've built something here. Something real, that doesn't just go away because of the past. Emily looked between the two men, her face filled with pain and uncertainty. I need time, she whispered. I need to figure this out on my own. Jack nodded, though Michael could see the fear in his eyes. Take all the time you need. Michael didn't speak. He simply nodded, knowing that there was nothing else he could say. This was Emily's decision, her life to rebuild however she saw fit, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. Emily stood slowly, her legs shaky as she walked toward the door. I need some air, she muttered, her voice thick with emotion. Without another word, she slipped out of the house, leaving Michael and Jack standing in the quiet aftermath of her departure. Michael's heart ached with every step she took away from him, but he knew this was what she needed. Time, space, a chance to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she had become. Jack remained seated, his hands covering his face as the silence between them stretched on. Finally, he spoke, his voice muffled by his hands. I'm losing her, aren't I? Michael swallowed hard, his own heart breaking in the quiet. I don't know, he admitted, but whatever happens, we have to let her make her own choice. Jack didn't respond, his shoulders shaking as the reality of their situation settled over him. Michael turned back toward the window, staring out at the darkening sky, knowing that the road ahead was far from clear. They had all lost so much already, and now everything hung in the balance of Emily's choice. The house was quieter than ever. It had been days since Emily had left to gather her thoughts, and the absence of her presence was a constant reminder of the weight of the situation. Michael and Jack had barely spoken to one another, each lost in their own thoughts, waiting for the inevitable. Michael spent most of his time near the window, staring out at the waves crashing against the shore. The sea seemed endless, much like the uncertainty of what would happen next. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything hung in the balance. Emily's decision would define not only her life, but his as well. But in truth, it would impact all of them, including Sophie. Jack, on the other hand, retreated into himself. He kept busy with the boat, making repairs and spending long hours at sea. When he did return to the house, there was an air of defeat about him, as if he had already resigned himself to losing the woman he loved. Michael had never expected to feel sympathy for Jack, but he did. Jack had saved Emily when she was at her most vulnerable, and though he had kept the truth from her, he had loved her in his own way. It wasn't simple. None of it was. On the morning of the third day, the sound of footsteps on the porch broke through Michael's thoughts. He stood up, his heart pounding as the door opened slowly. And there she was. Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but there was a calmness about her that hadn't been there before. Jack appeared in the doorway from the back room, his expression immediately tense, as though he had been holding his breath for days. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence was thick, filled with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. Michael's heart raced as he watched Emily step inside, her hands trembling slightly as she closed the door behind her. She glanced at Jack first, her eyes soft with a mixture of affection and sorrow. Then she looked at Michael, her gaze lingering for just a moment before she lowered her eyes to the floor. "I've made a decision," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Jack stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides. Michael took a slow breath, bracing himself for what was to come. Emily moved toward the center of the room, standing between the two men who had come to define the most important parts of her life, her past and her present. She looked at both of them, her expression filled with a deep sadness, as if she understood the pain her decision would cause, no matter which way she chose. "I've spent the last few days trying to remember," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "trying to figure out who I am and what I want. I've thought about the life I had before, about who Emily Turner was. But the truth is, I don't remember her. I don't remember that life, or the love we shared, Michael." Michael's heart clenched, the pain of her words cutting deep. He had feared this, feared that she would never be able to reconnect with the life they had shared, the love that had once meant everything to both of them. But hearing her say it out loud felt like a dagger to the chest. Emily's gaze shifted to Jack then, her expression softening. "But that doesn't mean I can just forget everything I've learned now. I can't ignore the truth about who I was. I'm not just Mary Coleman, Jack. I'm Emily too. And I need to figure out what that means for me." Jack's face was unreadable, but Michael could see the pain in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he stood there, waiting for the final blow. "I love you, Jack," Emily said, her voice filled with emotion. "You saved me when I had no one. You gave me a life when I was lost. But I need to find out who I really am. I need to figure out what part of Emily Turner still exists inside of me." Jack's expression tightened, and he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded slowly, the hurt evident in his eyes. He knew this wasn't what he wanted to hear, but deep down, he had known it all along. Michael's heart raced as he stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with hope. "Emily, I know this has been hard, and I don't expect you to just come back to a life you don't remember. But whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm here for you. Always." Emily turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered. "And that's why this is so hard. I don't remember our life together, Michael. But I see the love in your eyes, and I feel it. I know it's real. I don't know if I can go back to that." Michael nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You don't have to go back. We can move forward, together." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Emily closed her eyes, her tears falling freely now. She wiped them away quickly, taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I can't choose one life over the other," she said softly. "I need time to figure out who I am, to reconcile the woman I was with, the woman I've become. I don't want to lose either of you, but I know that's not fair." Jack let out a shaky breath, his voice breaking as he spoke. "So what does that mean for us? For you?" Emily looked at him, her expression pained. "It means I need space. I need time to figure this out on my own. I can't be with either of you right now. Not until I know who I really am." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Jack's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of her decision had finally crushed him. Michael stood still, the hope that had filled him only moments ago now replaced with a quiet acceptance. Emily took a step back, her gaze filled with sorrow as she looked at the two men who had come to mean so much to her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "but I have to do this. For me, for all of us." Michael nodded, his heart aching but understanding. "We'll be here," he said quietly. "Whenever you're ready." Jack said nothing, his face etched with pain as he stood there, watching the woman he loved walk away. Emily turned and walked toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate, as though each one was heavier than the last. She paused at the threshold, turning back to look at them one last time. Her eyes were filled with tears. But there was a calmness in her expression now, as if she had finally made peace with her decision. "I love you both," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I need to learn to love myself again." And with that, she stepped out into the world, leaving Michael and Jack standing in the quiet house, their lives forever changed by the woman they both loved. The days following Emily's departure felt like a fog that neither Michael nor Jack could shake. The house, once filled with the presence of the woman they both loved, now felt unbearably quiet. Each of them coped with the loss in their own way. Jack kept to himself, retreating to his boat and spending long hours at sea, while Michael wrestled with the uncertainty of what came next. Sophie hadn't returned since she ran out that night. Her absence weighed heavily on both men, though they hadn't spoken much about it. Michael tried calling her several times, leaving messages that went unanswered. Jack, on the other hand, didn't even try. His eyes held a resigned sadness, as though he believed Sophie had slipped away from them for good. But Michael refused to give up. He had already lost so much time with his daughter, and he wasn't about to let more slip through his fingers. On the 5th day after Emily's departure, there was a knock at the door. Michael, who had been sitting by the window as usual, jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. He opened the door to find Sophie standing there, her face pale but determined. "Sophie," Michael breathed, relief washing over him like a wave. She looked at him with those same wide, searching eyes that had haunted him since the moment he found out she was his daughter. There was a tension between them, but it wasn't as sharp as before. If anything, it felt like they were both waiting for the other to speak, to make sense of the chaos that had become their lives. "Can I come in?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet but steady. Michael nodded quickly, stepping aside to let her in. She glanced around the room, her eyes briefly landing on Jack, who had just entered from the kitchen, before settling on Michael again. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, standing in the middle of the room, her arms crossed over her chest. "About everything." Michael nodded, waiting for her to continue. Jack, too, remained silent, his expression unreadable as he leaned against the wall, watching her with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "I'm still angry," Sophie admitted, her voice shaky but firm. "I'm angry at both of you for not telling me the truth sooner, for keeping this huge part of my life hidden from me. But..." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I also understand why you did it." Jack's face softened, his eyes filling with unshed tears. Michael felt a wave of guilt and relief wash over him, grateful that Sophie was at least willing to listen, even if it didn't erase the mistakes they had made. "I don't know how to deal with all of this yet," Sophie continued. "I don't know how to be someone I didn't even know I was, but I want to try. I want to figure it out." Michael's chest tightened with emotion, but he kept his voice steady. "We'll figure it out together. However long it takes, I'm here for you." Sophie's gaze flicked toward Jack, and Michael saw the flash of pain in her eyes. "You, too," she said softly, You raised me. I know this is hard for you, but I can't pretend that everything's the same anymore. I need to know who I really am. That doesn't mean I don't love you." Jack swallowed hard, his voice thick as he spoke. "I know, Sophie. I love you too. No matter what happens, you'll always be my daughter." Sophie gave a small, shaky nod, her lips pressed together as if holding back more words, more emotions. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of everything they had lost and everything they still had to figure out pressing down on all of them. "I want to meet Emily," Sophie said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to ask so soon, but the request filled him with hope. "You should. I think it would help." Jack's face tightened, but he didn't object. There was a resignation in his eyes, as though he had come to accept that his role in Sophie's life would never be the same. He had raised her, loved her, and cared for her, but the truth had irrevocably changed everything. "She's trying to figure things out too," Michael added gently. "It's not easy for her, but I know she wants to meet you when you're ready." Sophie nodded, biting her lip. "I think I'm ready." Michael felt a rush of emotion, but he kept it contained. This was Sophie's journey, and he wasn't about to push her in any direction. "Whenever you're ready, I can make it happen." The three of them sat in silence for a few more minutes, the tension easing slightly as they shared the space, each of them processing in their own way. Eventually, Sophie stood, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she was carrying the weight of everything she had learned over the past few days. "I should go," she said quietly, looking between the two men. "I need some time." Michael nodded, his heart aching but understanding. "Take all the time you need." Jack didn't say anything, but the sadness in his eyes spoke volumes. Sophie turned to leave, pausing briefly at the door. "I'll be in touch," she said, offering a faint smile before stepping outside and closing the door softly behind her. The silence that followed was thick with emotion, but there was something different about it this time. It wasn't the suffocating tension of before. It was hope. Michael sat back down by the window, staring out at the horizon, his thoughts drifting to Emily. He didn't know where she was or what she was doing, but he hoped that she, too, was finding her way through the confusion. He hoped that, one day, they could all come together as the family they had been denied for so long. Jack stood quietly by the doorway, lost in his own thoughts. Michael knew that Jack's journey was different. His love for Emily and Sophie was deep, but he had to accept that the life he had built might never be the same again. Still, they were all connected by something that went beyond time, beyond memory. As the sun began to set over the ocean, casting a warm golden glow over the water, Michael allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The road ahead was uncertain, and there were no guarantees that things would be easy. But for the first time in years, he felt like there was a chance for healing, a chance for forgiveness, a chance for love, and that was enough.